What does it mean to be a Western yogi? How can someone who was born and raised in the West, who comes from a Judeo-Christian background, practice yoga and meditation in an authentic and genuine way? My name is Christopher Sartain, and this is the Western Yoga Podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Western Yoga Podcast. I'm doing something a little different in this episode, and I've got my first guest with me. Decided to begin a series of interviews as a part of this podcast, and I'm so delighted to be speaking with Philip Goldberg, and he is the author of many fine books. My favorite is American Veda, although I really love the life of Yogananda also. And we'll get into that book, American Veda, in this interview. Philip also does tours in India. He's a tour leader for trips to India for groups that are interested in touring northern India with him. And he has an excellent podcast called Spirit Matters. Highly recommend checking that out. I don't think I've missed too many episodes. To be quite honest, it's one of my favorite podcasts. And so, Philip, thank you so much for coming on with me here and being with us today.
My pleasure, Chris. Thanks for the kind introduction.
And I also have to mention that Philip has a webinar June 18th. I believe I'll publish this podcast probably tomorrow, which is June 17th. So if you happen to hear it, and you'd like to register for his webinar on the autobiography of a yogi. And Philip wrote a book, of course, biography of Paramahansa Yogananda. So he really is an expert on the life of Yogananda. And so he's got a webinar coming up Saturday, June 18th about Yogananda. And he also has a course that he gives where he really goes in depth. And so, Philip, you want to talk a little bit about the webinar and also the course?
Yeah, the webinar is essentially, it's free, and it's a preview of the course. And the course, which starts July 12th and runs for 10 sessions, weekly sessions on Tuesdays. Tuesdays at 8:30, I guess it would be Chilean time, and PM, and it's sponsored by Hindu University of America, so you could find details at hua.edu. And we did it once. I taught it semester before last, and it was a real delight. We dig into the autobiography of a yogi in the order of the chapters, a few chapters at a time, each session, and we dig into it. And my favorite part is I get to bring in information that Yogananda left out about the book itself and episodes in the book, and mainly about his life, because one of the reasons I wrote a biography of Yogananda was realizing how much he left out of his own autobiography. And so there's a lot of juicy stuff and a lot of interesting stuff, and in many ways transformative stuff that we can bring out based on the autobiography. So it's a great experience for me as well as the students, because it's the kind of book where you learn something new each time you open it, and I've opened it many times over the course of my life.
Yes, as have I, as have hundreds of millions probably of people and spiritual seekers and yogis. Certainly what got me started on this yoga path. And
it's not what got me started, but I read it in the very early days of my path. And I should mention for your audience that I never became a formal student of Yogananda's or a disciple, but he's, I always admired him and always respected his work and understood uh, the huge role he played in bringing yogic teachings to the West. And when I wrote about him in American Veda, and I realized how much was left out of his own book and how many, even his closest people, weren't aware of certain aspects of his life, I decided to write a full-on biography. And then I ended up discovering a lot more that I didn't even know I would discover. So that's how it all happened.
Yes, it's a wonderful book. I can recall Mr. Davis, very rarely would he recommend to his students books outside of his own books and the books of Yogananda. But I remember in a newsletter that he sent out, there was an advertisement for your book in it, and he was recommending to all of us that we should read it. And that's pretty high praise coming coming from Mr. Davis.
No, I was, yes, and I was very grateful and honored and very, delighted that he did it and reviewed it favorably. And then I was also thrilled that we were able to interview him for my podcast that you mentioned, Spirit Matters, and which was probably the last time I spoke to him. I'd met him a couple of times and interviewed him for American Veda, then interviewed him for my biography of Yogananda. And then we were lucky enough to get him on the podcast before he passed.
Yes. And he's had high praise for your book and also for American Veda. He really liked that book.
Yes, he was a fan of American Veda early on, and that's how our paths first crossed. And he was a lovely man.
Indeed. Well, American Veda, I have to say, it was one of the primary inspirations for me wanting to start this podcast, the Western Yoga podcast. I read American Veda about 5 years ago, I think, for the first time. I've read it three or four more times since. And this book was a huge inspiration for me because as a Western yogi, so-called, it gave me the historical context out of which my spiritual path arose. And it was just such an important and vital part of my path. I can't really express it in words, but for a Jew, for example, they can easily read the Torah and they can see the historical context out of which their spirituality arises. A Christian can read the letters of Paul in the New Testament and certainly the canonical Gospels and have some idea the historical context out of which their spirituality arises. And of course, we can look back to the ancient yoga texts and read books about the history of yoga, the yoga tradition by George Feuerstein, for example, and all of that. And that's very helpful, obviously. But specifically as Western yogis, it's a strange niche, isn't it? And so there's not a lot out there, or of very high quality, that really explains and gives all of that cultural and historical context out of which our spirituality as quote unquote Western yogis arises. And so really it's like it's almost like part of my Bible in a way, so to say, because
That's
it gives
very
me
sweet.
It gives me that foundation. It makes me feel grounded when I read it because I understand how I can practice yoga and meditation in an authentic and genuine way as a Westerner and feel really good about it. And so you want to take us through a little bit like why you decided to write American Veda? What was your inspiration for wanting to write it?
Yes, and thank you for what you just said, because every time I hear something like that, and I've heard it often over the years since the book was published, I get emails like, "Oh, I just read American Veda. It's the story of my life." And for especially for people of a certain age,
Mm.
who remembered the sort of central role that the 60s and 70s played in this whole story. But also, um, I especially like hearing it from people who are yoga teachers or are an integral part of and one of the lineages that were started in the West by the various gurus who came here. Because what they find is that they're part of something bigger than they realize.
Mm.
And that like when I speak to yoga teachers, very often they know they're part of a lineage, but they only know a limited picture of their lineage. They think of their teacher and their teacher's teacher, or maybe their teacher's teacher's teacher, but they don't realize what I call the Maha lineage, the bigger lineage that everybody who's a yogi in whatever form they practice is part of. So at a certain point, you asked how I came to write American Veda. My spiritual path began in the late 1960s, and it took, particular form, particular shape. After a while, I began to realize that all the different gurus who came here, going back to the 1890s with Swami Vivekananda, who was the first of who had a big impact. Then Yogananda, and then all the gurus who came in the 60s and 70s and subsequently. They had a mark, particularly in America, but also in Canada and Mexico and South America and Europe. And maybe I should write South American Veda. That would be
please.
fun. That would be fun to research.
Mm.
But in any event, they all had an impact. Many of them had an impact, and they left behind people they trained to carry on their teachings, and institutions, organizations, often buildings, centers, temples, and so forth. And that the collective input of all those different orientations, different lineages, different methods, a huge cross-section of the yogic legacy, the yogic heritage, was implanted and adapted to a new culture, a new period of time, and so forth. So it started to constitute an expression of the eternal teachings of yoga, what many people would just think of as, if they wanted to think of in religious terms, they would think of it as the Hindu Dharma or the Vedic heritage. Yoga is a more neutral term, so let's stick to that. And it took on its own forms. And when I realized it was having a bigger impact than met the eye, it was making inroads into how people in the West understand things like religion and spirituality, how they approach their own spiritual lives, how it was affecting disciplines like psychology and psychotherapy and even medicine, when people started researching the health benefits of yogic practices, especially meditation. And you started to see it in surveys and polls where people are asked about their spiritual experiences, their attitudes about religion, spirituality. You started to see the impact. And I started to see that in the 80s. And by then I was writing professionally and had published some books. And I thought, there's a book in this. And so I wrote a book proposal, and my agent at the time sent it out, and nobody was interested. Nobody could see that there was anything to my argument, except one editor whose name I won't mention, but his bosses turned it down. So I said, I'm obviously ahead of my time in this case, or else I'm crazy. So I set it aside. And then about 20 years later, in the mid 2000s, an editor at one of the Random House divisions had a similar idea, because by then, everything I had seen in the 80s was much more obvious. The impact was much more pronounced and much more evident. And that editor happened to mention his idea to my agent, and my agent said, I have just the guy to write the book. And that's how it happened. And then I set out and did a few years of research that validated my hunch, and took it much further than even I had anticipated. So the book became the history of how yogic teachings came to the West. And in the subtitle, my wife is always fond of offering the subtitle when people ask what the book is about, because it says it all. The subtitle is From Emerson to the Beatles, how Indian spirituality, from Emerson and the Beatles to yoga and meditation, how Indian spirituality changed the West. So I go into all the different ways it has affected Western culture. And now when I speak about it, I update it with, things that have happened since publication. But that's what it's about. And so you see what you're part of if you're a Western yogi, and how it all came here, and that it's bigger than even you may have thought.
That's right. Would you say at this point that Western yoga has enough history now? And of course, we're only talking about 100 years here, more or less. But
like 200.
You're right. If we go back to the transcendentalists and Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman,
right,
and everything they were talking about, they were already reading translations of. You're right. So let's say 200 years.
Even 250 at this point, you could say. But
sure,
be that as it may.
No. You're the expert. I want to get this right. So let's say 250 years.
200 plus.
Okay. Now, when I was thinking 100 years, I was thinking like, as far as yoga being sort of more of a well-known or popularized, or more of a household sort of word that,
yes,
yes, let's say at least half of Americans would recognize, or something like that. But you're right, it has a much deeper, even richer history.
Well, Yogananda came here. Yogananda came 102 years ago.
That's right.
And so that was a turning point. But a lot of he didn't come into a vacuum.
Right.
A lot of groundwork had been done prior to his coming.
A lot. And so, but would you say that, and I want to talk a little bit about that too, some of that groundwork that was laid by, especially Thoreau. I want to hear you talk about Thoreau. But let's say that yoga is very young here in the West, obviously compared to India. But do we have enough history now that Western yoga has has diverged enough from its original roots, let's say, that it has become, in a way, it's it's hard to define these things, but has it become, in a way, its sort of own path or its own tradition? I think about Bhakti Fest. You know, I think about these sort of like
Yes. Yes.
these
Hmm.
kirtan festivals, these yoga festivals. You know, the wanderlust and all of this subculture that has arisen. So, my question to you, and we don't have to give a black and white sort of answer, but has yoga evolved and changed enough in the West now that has become sort of its own semi-divergent path in a way?
Yeah. This is, uh, as you suggest, a complicated
Hmm.
question. And it's one that academic scholars, which I'm not, uh, some of them will debate that or researching it and coming up with theories about it, and calling it different names. And I should add that in in Buddhist circles, similar discussion is taking place. Do we have a Western Buddhism? Is it different? Because it's different from or ordinary Buddhism in Asia. Does it have a character of its own? Does it deserve a category, a
Mm,
classification?
right.
Similar with yoga. With yoga, it's even more complicated because what do we mean by yoga?
Yeah.
So, yoga has come in the West, unfortunately, to be primarily identified in the public mind with hatha yoga, with the physical practices of yoga. And the the teachers and lineages that emphasize meditative practices or devotional practices are not often grouped together in the category of yoga, even though they are truer to the intent of yoga and the history of yoga than those who emphasize or exclusively uh, look at or devote themselves to the physical practices. So, I often give talks called A Nation of Yogis, and I make the case that there are yogis who don't even know they're yogis, who wouldn't think of themselves as yogis, who would never set foot on a yoga mat and can't reach their knees, let alone their toes. But they're yogis in the true sense of seeking union and engaging in practices that cultivate the union that yoga stands for. So it gets even more complicated.
That's right.
But I think the answer is clearly yes, that there is such a thing as Western yoga, only there are many, many subdivisions of it and many subcategories that would go under that heading of what is Western yoga. But even in India, yoga is different than it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago because things evolve. Just as, you know, Christianity is different in America than it is in Western Europe or South America, and it's different now than it was 200 years ago because things change and culture changes and the teachings adapt. And the gurus who came to the West knew that better than anybody. You can see in their work that they were busy adapting to the Western way of life, to the orientation of science, to a secular country, to a predominantly Christian country. You could see it, I emphasize that in American Veda, and I also emphasize it in my biography of Yogananda. You could see it in his work, how you could see it just if you look at the titles of his public talks. You could see he's learning what is important to Americans. You wouldn't say the same things in India. You wouldn't use the same language in India. So the language changes, the delivery systems change. At a certain point, Yogananda created a correspondence course. The later gurus had videotapes and then the internet. All that changes how things are oriented. Different values, different needs, different discoveries. When these yogic methods began to be researched by scientists, then the language of brain waves and blood pressure and stress and all these other factors entered into the conversation of yoga. So it definitely takes on different forms, many different forms. But if you were a scholar and did research, you could see commonalities and you could see trends that you could either call modern yoga or Western yoga or modern Western yoga. And some of it would be similar to developments even in India, and some of it would be unique to the West. So that's what happens to anything useful, whether it's a form of technology or an art form. Music migrates all over the world, and one form of music is integrated into another. We saw, for example, in the 60s, as I wrote in American Veda, Indian music became popular when George Harrison discovered the sitar. And now all of a sudden the sitar and Indian musical motifs were in rock and roll. And you see it, there's Indian musicians playing jazz on indigenous Indian instruments. So this kind of thing happens. It happens in food, it happens in art, it also happens in spirituality. So, and healthcare and all technology and everything else. So it's inevitable that there would become a Western yoga, and it'll change. If we had this conversation in 20 years, things will be different. But the thing I want to make sure we bring people's attention to is, what is commonly called cultural appropriation,
right?
Which is very hard sometimes to distinguish between acceptable forms of adaptation of something. But sometimes in the process of a culture adopting something from another culture, it changes to the point where it doesn't do justice to the original or becomes something totally different. And in the case of yoga, the concern is that commercialism and the Western values and so forth will alter yoga to the point where its original power and depth and enormity of vision will be distorted and diluted. So it becomes a form of exercise in people's minds, which is, fine in and of itself if that's what you want. But if in the process, the bigger teachings of yoga, the more profound and consequential ones are lost, then that's something we all have to be vigilant about and to protect it, even while it's being adapted and changed.
Yes, I completely agree. I find it interesting that Westerners tend to Westerners that are interested, let's say, in more esoteric practices or mysticism, really deep spirituality, they tend to gravitate towards foreign or exotic systems, mystical systems, let's say, rather than exploring some of the Western mystical traditions, like it goes all the way back to Pythagoras and Plato and the Essenes, and then the original and Jesus Christ, and then the the Christian mystics and the Desert Fathers and all this. And so we have this rich tradition, the writings of Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, Saint Francis of it. It goes on and on. So, what is it, or what is your theory, if you have one, about why Westerners tend to gravitate towards the more exotic or foreign systems rather than exploring some of the Western mystical tradition?
A few things. First, the sources that you just mentioned, very few people know about.
Right. Why is that?
And historically, and I bring this out in American Veda, but before I answer that question, more people know about them now than ever before.
Mm.
I remember being introduced to Thomas Merton in the late 60s. I'd never heard of him. I wasn't raised Christian, but none of my Christian friends had heard of him either. If they'd heard of Merton, that they were okay if they heard of Merton, but they didn't know St. John of the Cross. They didn't know Teresa of Avila. They didn't know Meister Eckhart. And, St. Francis was just maybe, a poem, or something. Similarly, Jews didn't know about Jewish mysticism, about Kabbalah or anything like that. Only a very few people did. They were these esoteric, and in the world of Islam, very, Sufism, which is the mystical branch of Islam, was either suppressed or people, it was sort of ostracized. So people weren't aware of it. And so if people had a spiritual yearning and it wasn't being met by conventional religion, when they discovered the teachings of the East, and this really took off in the 60s, when certain books became very popular, and the Autobiography of a Yogi was one of them, became popular in the counterculture, the hippie world that people like me were seekers and part of. We had more access, and then gurus started to come. Those teachings appealed to us because the teachings themselves and the interpreters of those teachings who wrote about them and the gurus who started to come, they all made the point that these are universal teachings. The explanations were rational and the approach was empirical. No one said you have to believe in this, that, or you'll go to hell, or that it was anything having to do with belief. It had to do with direct experience. So we were told, doesn't matter if you're a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, an atheist, and whatever you are, it doesn't matter. These are universal teachings. This is a science of consciousness, a science of spirituality. Yogananda's first lecture in America was called The Science of Religion. It was not Hinduism. It was the science of religion. Similarly, the Buddhist teachers who came here had the similar orientation. And so this was very appealing. And it could, these teachings could adapt. And that was people's introduction into what you might call mysticism or direct path of spirituality. It opened up the inner life, the inner dimension of spirituality, the dimension of personal inner experience of the divine, independent of belief and dogma and all that. That's why the teachings of the East appealed and caught on. One of the many effects of these teachings catching on is it opened the doors to greater understanding and greater access to Christian mysticism, Jewish mysticism, Sufism. And so now there's a huge number of people engaged in contemplative Christianity and doing forms of Christian meditation, similar things in the smaller, world of Jews. That's a direct result of the acceptance and integration of the teachings from the East. Some of it is so obvious that there's like people doing essentially adapting mantra forms of meditation into a Christian or Jewish context, changing instead of Sanskrit mantras, for example, using Hebrew or Aramaic or terms out of the New Testament. So it's very clear, and it led to a rediscovery and a democratization of the forms of mysticism that had been buried and only practiced by Trappist monks or esoteric rabbis and that sort of thing. Now they're more available and accessible. It's one of the things that happened as yogic teachings became integrated into the West.
It's interesting that the Eastern teachings and Eastern mysticism sort of rekindled an interest in Western mysticism, isn't it? And then the Western interest in yoga, and especially the physical practice of it, rekindled an interest in Hatha yoga in India. Isn't that interesting how the two have
it's
contaminated one another, so to say?
Some Western scholars have termed it the pizza effect. Pizza was a small regional dish in Italy. And then it came to America and became pizza in all of its many expressions. And it became a household dish. And then it went back to Italy and spread all over because, and a lot of the gurus predicted that. One of the, many of them said, when these teachings catch on in the West and scientists validate their effect, Indians will pay attention. And that, because the teaching, the yoga was always alive. It was always well in India, but it was relegated to ashrams and monastic orders for the most part. The householder, the everyday Indian person was not, engaged in yogic practices to the same extent you would think. And now it spread, because I remember being in India in like 2001 and seeing in one of the Sunday newspapers a big feature story essentially saying yoga is good for you. You should, people are practicing. And I thought, where am I? People in India have to be told this. And then when I read the article, it was all about Western scientists doing studies on yoga and Western celebrities practicing it. That had an impact even in India. So because, it wasn't, people realized it had value in their lives. It wasn't just an artifact of the ancient past. It wasn't irrelevant to what was important in everyday life for Indians, their health, their prosperity, and so forth. And that, it was an important bit of little feedback. And it's strange, but it speaks to the well, it speaks to a lot about colonial history and all that, but it also speaks to how important, how much respect science has in the modern world, all over the world. The validation through scientific experiments that think something is useful and valuable carries a lot of weight.
Absolutely. Certainly, I think that's one of the best things, really, that has happened to yoga and meditation in the West is the all of the scientific investigations that have been done proving the beneficial nature of yoga and meditation. And of course, that has influenced then the practice of yoga and meditation all over the world as more and more scientific studies come to light.
And there are thousands of them now.
Thousands. It's impressive. It's impressive. The amount of data that we have to work with now compared to even 20 years ago, 10 years ago. It just keeps accumulating.
Let alone 50 when I was involved in the early days.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the origin story of yoga in the West, if you don't mind. Maybe taking us all the way back to sort of the transcendentalists, perhaps. That might be a good place to start. You can go even further.
I'll try to give you the. I'll give you the shorter version.
Yeah, the brief synopsis.
I'll have to give you the short version of what.
Obviously, you have to read American Veda to.
What takes up a number of opening chapters. The connection between the West and India goes back, to Greek days, the days of ancient Greece, and Alexander the Great and Pythagoras and all those people. But it was a slow thing, and for the most part, the image people had of India was, of a backward, primitive culture in the West, and religiously, people would have thought of it as heathens, and all that. But that started to change in the early part of the 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, when some of the Europeans, the Brits and Germans especially, who studied Indian sacred texts and culture, started to realize there was more to it than they thought, and there was more of value and more sophistication. And it was something to be taken seriously. So some reasonably good translations and commentaries started to come out. And some of those reached American shores. Boston was the center of sort of culture back in the early 19th century. And that, led to a great deal of interest among intellectuals and seekers in New England, especially. And that led to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's a key figure in this history and in American history in general. And Emerson was strongly influenced by the texts that were available to him back then. And you could see it in his work and his essays, his poems, and his speeches and everything. And the more famous he became, the more these teachings became known. And one of his, early people he mentored was Henry David Thoreau. I have to get the pronunciation right. Thoreau, who in his masterwork, Walden, writes that he was a yogi, and he talks about reading the Bhagavad Gita at Waldo Pond. So that was the real beginning of the spread of these teachings, because those guys became, household words in America, and they're still read to this day by, students in high school and college. That was the real beginning. And the group known as the Transcendentalists, of whom Emerson and Thoreau were the most famous, had an enduring impact on American philosophy and how Americans see the world and all that. And if you look at Emerson's work, you see the imprint of India throughout, but especially from a certain point on, similarly with Thoreau. And so that was really the beginning. And they had an influence on what became known as the New Thought movement, which was a kind of combination of Western metaphysics and Eastern thought and practice. And many of their offshoots are more popular now than they were 100 years ago. And that was really the origins. And as I always joke, back in the days of when Emerson and Thoreau were living in Concord, Massachusetts, there were no yoga studios, no meditation centers, and they only had books. But those books had a huge impact. And then in turn, Emerson and Thoreau, their writings had a huge impact. And then the New Thought people had a bigger impact. And so it spread. And then Swami Vivekananda came in 1893, and the groundwork laid by the Transcendentalists and the New Thought people ignited interest in him and his interpretation of Vedanta and philosophy and so forth. And he established the first institutions and organizations, and legacy continues with swamis in his tradition coming to the West and running the Vedanta centers. Then Yogananda came in 1920, as we said, and the wave of gurus in 50s, 60s, 70s. So it all grew from there. But the real origin was when respectable translations and commentaries started to come here from Europe.
Thank you so
That's
much.
the short version.
Yeah, the short version.
Yeah.
But again, if you are, serious, I guess we could say yogi living in the West, and you're from the West and you were raised in a sort of Judeo-Christian culture, you just have to read the book. You just do. It will give you a sense of being grounded in a tradition. A lot of times we as Westerners feel sort of separated or distanced somehow from the yoga tradition because we're not Indian, we're not from India, we didn't grow up around that culture and all that. And so this book, American Veda, really gives you an orientation, a context, and a grounding in being part of something that is alive and lively and evolving and growing. And it just gives you such a wonderful sense of being part of something important, something that matters. And so where do you see Western yoga going, let's say in the next 20 to 30 years? How do you see it evolving further? For example, does the guru still have a role to play in Western yoga? It hasn't been the smoothest transition here into this guru yoga, so to say. So do you see that? How do you see this moving forward?
You're asking another complicated question, Chris. I'm often asked this, and I always joke that it was hard enough to get the past correct, let alone the future. Uh, but you could see trends. And, one thing I feel safe in saying is that the influence of the yogic legacy will only keep growing. Because, just like anything else that's of value, practical value in people's lives, I always say, Americans are very strange people. But one thing you could say about them is if something works, they may resist it at first, but if it works and it has value, they'll eventually come to accept it and adopt it and maybe corrupt it or transmit it in a different way. So that's going to happen. The research, the personal experience, the word of mouth, all of that. It will take different forms. So you may not even recognize it. So if you go, for example, to a retreat being led by, on Christian mysticism or contemplative Judaism or something, you wouldn't necessarily see the impact of yoga, but it's there. You might read a book by a psychologist or go to a psychology conference, and you'll see the imprint of yoga in certain ways when they talk about research on consciousness, or they talk about the importance of, some form of meditation or on stress reduction. They won't use the language of yoga necessarily, but they will have been influenced by it either directly or indirectly. So that kind of influence will spread. And I'm hopeful that there's enough people who understand the fullness of what yoga is to act as safeguards to those who will corrupt it out of either ignorance or greed or other motives. More and more people, some people, will go to a yoga studio because they want to look good or feel better. But a certain portion of those people it'll just be a form of exercise. But another portion of those people will begin to see there's more to it. And if they have a spiritual inkling, they'll find their way to something more than yoga as exercise. That will continue. Even in India, there's people who do yoga just as exercise for their health. And there's those who are serious spiritual seekers. So it's always going to be that way. But the influence will grow. And I think it's those of us who care about yoga and think that these teachings have a role to play, not only in making individual lives better, but making society a wiser, more peaceful place. We have some responsibility in not just spreading the word, but protecting the tradition so that it's adapted in a responsible way that doesn't dilute or distort the fullness of it. But that's the direction, I feel comfortable saying that because if you look at the trends in spirituality that researchers find every few years, there's a new study, for example, and they'll show, oh, look, the number of people who don't identify with a mainstream religion has grown. The spiritual, but not religious. The number of people who say the most important thing is their direct experience of the divine or of God, if they use that language, is more important than membership in a tradition of some kind, or in a church or a synagogue. That continues to grow. Those are yogis. It's a more yogic way of being in the world. That's the trend, and I hope it continues. I think it's a good chance it will.
Yes, me too. I see it moving in that direction. Of course, Paramahansa Yogananda envisioned the growth of yoga. He said back in the 30s and 40s, oh, someday you'll see yoga being taught in schools. And
Yeah, and it is.
Mr. Davis, I believe, was there when he said that, and some people kind of scoffed at it and thought, no, master, that will never happen. And there I was, when I lived in Colorado for a couple of years in a small charter school there. I taught in a small charter school. And sure enough, every day we started our day with yoga and meditation with all of our middle school students. And of course, it's taught widely in various schools, public schools, private schools, colleges, universities, and has become completely mainstreamed. But like you said, how do we preserve the original teachings and context of yoga in a responsible way? It's
Right.
really key.
And it's challenging because even, to introduce it to schools in many cases, it had to be so secularized
Yeah,
that, in order to be acceptable to the
that's right.
authorities, that, something may be lost.
Mm,
So this is a challenge. It's a challenge of language. It's a challenge of presentation. It's a challenge of, responsible citizenship in a sense.
mm,
So, there's no one answer to how do we do it. It's just we have to be attentive to protecting the legacy and the integrity of yoga, at the same time being flexible and adaptable, because otherwise it doesn't get spread, it doesn't reach people.
mm.
That's the challenge. Yogananda had the same challenge 100 years ago. So, it's ongoing and it will be different in different contexts.
That's
So,
right.
we just have to do our best and call it out when it's distorted or
Mm,
corrupted. You know, like, no, I'm sorry. Yoga's more than that.
mm,
You can't limit yoga to what you're saying.
mm. Excellent. That's
But
right. Thank you so much for doing this and being a
my
part of
pleasure.
my little humble podcast here. How can people find you? What's the best place for them to go online to find all of your offerings?
Well, my website is philipgoldberg.com, so that's easy. My podcast, Spirit Matters, is at spiritmatterstalk.com, and the same name for the YouTube channel.
Mm,
But yeah, my website is the best place, and my books and all that, everything. I try to keep up with what I'm doing, but I'm usually behind on my website. But
oh, we
that's how
all
to
are.
reach me, and I'm happy to, and this upcoming course on autobiography of a yogi
Mm,
starts in July. They can find out about that on hua.edu. And I hope people, listening will consider taking classes. And if the timing doesn't seem to work for you, know that if you register and can't make the class live, you have access to the video and the online conversation. And yeah, and I'm happy you can reach me personally through my website, and I'll be happy to hear from people.
as I did. Yeah, thank you
Yeah,
so much.
great.
You're just such an invaluable resource for Western yogis. I don't know what we would do without you, to tell you the truth. American Veda is that important. I believe it's
Oh,
really
I'm not that important, but I appreciate it.
well. Don't sell yourself short. I mean, and I've spoken to other students of Mr. Davis and just other Western yogis that have told me also the same thing, that your book was just such an important foundational part of their spiritual path. And so, and again, it was one of the main inspirations for me wanting to start this podcast, because I do see Western yoga as sort of evolving into its own tradition or its own path, so to say. And so having watched that occur, and again, yeah, I'm 42. I've only been practicing yoga since I was about 20, so 22 years. So I don't have as much experience as a lot of other folks in this field, but I have seen it evolve just in 22 years drastically, really. And
Yeah.
living in South America, it's even younger here, and so it's really starting to boom here, really starting to blossom. And so it's a really beautiful thing to watch and be a part of and participate in.
I'm
And
sure.
so I feel like we're really doing something meaningful here in the West as we adapt these teachings to Westerners and Western values and Western culture, while trying to preserve that original beauty of the original teachings of yoga, and that we find in the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita and sutras and all that. And so you're just such an integral part of what we're doing as Western yogis, whether you realize it or not. And I think 30 years from now, people will read your book and find it highly, highly valuable. And so just thank you so much, Philip.
Thank you, Chris, for the kind words. I appreciate it very much. Happy to be with you, and I hope I'll see you in Chile or
yes, please,
someplace in person.
Please come. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And I'd love to do a tour
Good
someday
deal.
with you in India. That would just be a dream come true.
Yes.
Really wonderful.
Please do.
Mm-hmm. You've got one coming up in February, is that right?
Next February, fingers crossed about COVID and all that. But we're scheduled to do, we had to suspend the tours for COVID because of the pandemic, but we're hoping to resume in February of 2023.
Beautiful. Well, thanks so much, Philip. Namaste.
Okay. Namaste. Take care.